The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Gaia, the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. 5,000 years of wisdom on demand. Get your first month for only 99 cents. Visit Gaia.com/Jim. That's Gaia.com/Jim to see what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. Thanks, Gaia. And the Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by My Patriot Supply. Get their 4-week survival food supply for only $99. Ready for survival when you need it. Call 888-440-7839 or go online at preparewithjim.com. Thanks, My Patriot Supply.
This is the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold.
Welcome to the Paranormal Podcast. I'm Jim Harold and so glad to be with you once again. And I think we have a fantastic show for your enjoyment tonight. We're going to start off with an interview with Annie Jacobsen. She's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. She's a New York Times bestseller. She's been on the program multiple times. You'll see her on the big talk shows. I just saw her on CBS this morning not too long ago. And she visits us when she gets a chance to talk about her books, and the new one is Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. And then in part 2 of the show, we have another great interview. Preston Dennett joins us to talk about Inside UFOs, True Accounts of Contact with Extraterrestrials. So I think we've got a humdinger on tap for you this week. A quick announcement before we get to the show. Many of you may have tried out our old app, Jim Harold Central, and that app has been retired, so you can delete that from your devices. And we will have a new app coming soon, and it will be much, much more full-featured for both free listeners and Plus Club listeners. So many different features that we'll tell you about, but it's very exciting. So, you know, obviously you caught it this time, so you have other ways of listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, on the website, and all those places still work. The only thing this changes is the app called Jim Harold Central. If you happen to have that on your device, you can go ahead and delete that from your device because it is no longer in service. But we'll have a new one. Hopefully the plan is sometime in July if everything plans out. But however you're listening now, it obviously works. So don't want to confuse people. But we have a new app on the way, so stay tuned for that. And now we're going to talk with Annie Jacobsen. Today we have a fantastic guest, really one of our favorite guests on the program. She has been with us before to talk about some of the other books, and this one is no exception to the litany of great work she's done. I'm talking about Annie Jacobsen. She is a journalist, best-selling author, and 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist. Her books have included Area 51, Operation Paperclip, and The Pentagon's Brain. Each were New York Times bestsellers and have been collectively published in many languages. And today we're going to talk about her newest book, Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis. And we're so glad to have her with us once again. Annie, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think that the perception is out there in the mainstream that when you talk about things like remote viewing and these kind of things, it's almost kind of crept into the area of a joke. You know, kind of let's have a giggle and a laugh, kind of the men who stare at goats idea. But the U.S. government didn't consider all of this a joke, did they?
Not only did they not consider it a joke, when you really look at the broad spectrum of the research, you're looking at decades. This work into things like extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, map dowsing, really, as I cover it in the book Phenomena, goes from immediately after the end of World War II all the way through the Cold War and to the present day. I myself was surprised to find how big and broad the scope of this research actually was. It's not by any means limited to remote viewing.
Now, so let's talk about that. How broad are we talking in terms of the investigation that you were able to uncover that the U.S. government has participated?
Well, let's talk big picture for a second, because I think it's a great place to start. As a national security reporter, what really interested me and continues to interest me is this idea that if you look back, across millennium, and you consider that superstition and magic were hallmarks of national security effort. I mean, we're talking back to sort of early civilizations. This is how nation states ran their national security affairs, doing things like consulting oracles, reading birds in flight. And so after the scientific revolution, you had this movement toward science, science, science. But having written the book about DARPA, The Pentagon's Brain, my last book, and seeing how intensely nation states now rely upon advanced science and technology to sort of lead the charge, I was really interested that we look at it like sort of advanced science and technology are our new superstition and magic, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can kind of go in to the research with that in mind, that's what I was really interested in. I think the reader winds up having many of the same surprises that I had while I was researching this, to learn that, over the decades, the research into you would maybe call it paranormal, I would call it supernormal,
mm-hmm.
individuals who have some kind of extra sense, if you will. You see a matching of the government, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community using the science and technology available to them in that day to try and understand, A, what this is, and then B, to make the programs operational. And so that, I thought, was the most invigorating new sort of narrative that I was able to bring to the table, where maybe the reader gets to see, like, wow, this is a fluid and rapidly changing situation, ending up with the idea that today's ESP programs, which are still going on, exist under the banner of advanced technology. They're called things like anomalous mental cognition. The Office of Naval Research refers to one of its sort of precognition programs as the Spidey sense. And so it kind of makes your mind, it creates this idea of like, wow, this is an age-old mystery and no one's giving up anytime soon on trying to solve it. That, to me, is exciting.
And I want to get to those early days and how this all started for the U.S. government, but I do want to ask you a question that kind of goes back to my introduction. The idea that all of this is, something that we kind of laugh and giggle about when we see it, do you think that's maybe a little bit of planned disinformation from the government trying to throw us off the scent? Why do you think we think it's a joke?
Well, I wouldn't claim to know, but I could give you my opinion. And my take is it might have more to do with pop culture's kind of use of sarcasm. That people are generally, afraid of being pigeonholed into believing something that's not scientific. And so it's easier to make fun of something than to ask questions about it. Now, with that said, the scientific skeptics that I interviewed for this book would say that's an absurd excuse and you're, displaying your intellectual inferiority by even saying such a thing. But I disagree. I think there's a lot to be learned about taking the whole subject matter seriously. And I don't mean literally, but I mean seriously.
No, I agree. Go ahead.
For me, my new book, Phenomena, is really a book about the outer reaches of what can be known. Not what we know to be true, but what can we know? What might we know? It's about exploration. And it's also about getting lost. Because explorers get lost. Metaphorically and literally. And I think some of the sarcasm that you talk about, the public's perception of these programs being, foolish, comes from the fact that there are a number of players, and I report about them. I report them in my book and relate their narratives. Brilliant minds who take this research to the gates of hell. It results in their downfall and demise because they pursue ideas that perhaps another scientist would say, that definitely needs to remain in the hypothesis phase. And the person becomes convinced of their own research and sort of ignores the scientific method and ignores scientific rigor and is drawing conclusions where an objective scientist would say you can't make that conclusion.
Now, the early days, did this start immediately post-Second World War? And I'm also interested, you talked about government and kind of these mystic ideas. And I think about the Germans, for example, who supposedly had a very big emphasis on that, and Hitler and so forth. And yeah, I remember your book, Operation Paperclip, and we talked about that. And then on the other side, the Soviets, who have definitely done a lot of PK research, or did a lot of PK research. So talk to us about the earlier years, and was it informed by either of these past and future enemies?
Yes. I mean, it's interesting that it's not just the early days of the Cold War. You're actually talking about the last days of war in the European theater. And this is based on a series of declassified documents I looked long and hard at called the Das Narbe documents, and those were Heinrich Himmler's, that was his science organization, science being in quotes because some of it was science and some of it was pseudoscience, and one element of Das Narbe was looking into ESP, map dowsing, the black arts, any element, any bizarre sort of rites and rituals of the occult that you can imagine Himmler was into. Interestingly, as I report in the book, Hitler hated it, okay? But Himmler and others, not Speer, but his deputy director, they were very into the occult. And there was a lot of this documentation that remained hidden from the public until very recently. We now know influenced the research that the CIA did almost immediately upon its creation after 1947. And the idea behind that was, we got half of the Das Narbe documents, we being our military intelligence unit called Alsace, which captured these documents. But guess who got the other half? The Soviets. The Soviets. And so that is really the origin story of the psychic arms race between the Soviets and the United States. It was, well, wait a minute, we better look into this, because what if there's something here, and what if the Soviets get ahead? And I find that really interesting. It's sort of the chicken and the egg, or the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail of this early looking into the occult, into the supernatural. I think it's also where a lot of the stigma comes from.
Now, usually in something like this, there is a champion for a cause. Let's do this. John Kennedy, let's go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Was there a champion or champions of looking into this in those early days?
That's a great question. I mean, boy, is that a great question. I think not is what comes to mind. I think that initially it was more the reverse of that. It was, let's make sure there isn't a champion here, right? And also because so much of this research was secret, well, it was all classified. All of the research that I report in the book was always part of what's called a SAP program, Special Access Program. And that is deeply classified. It has serious protocols that keep everybody out and a very select few in. And I think the reasons from all the interviews, and I interviewed 55 of the original players on these programs in both CIA and Defense Department to report the book, what they told me was that it was twofold. It was, one, we need to keep this research secret so that the Soviets don't find out about it. And the other was to kind of build a wall between themselves and the naysayers. Because long before you had journalists kind of, poking fun at this research, you had members of Congress horrified by it. And one of the most interesting things I found in the book is that the group that was most horrified was the very religious Christian right that took offense to all of this because it stepped upon these ideas of the devil. And that was super interesting. Very, very hard to report on, by the way, because no one wants to talk about that. So maybe there's another book in that subject, but super interesting.
Yeah, that is. And before you even said it, I said, I bet it was the conservatives, because that fly against the face of many things they believe in. Well, we'll move on, because there's so much in this book. And folks, if you're interested in this, you need to get this book, full stop, period. But I want to go on to a little bit of the CIA years, and I'm looking here at the table of contents. One name jumps out at me. We've had an opportunity a few months ago, incredibly, in my mind, to interview him. And I'm talking about Uri Geller. Now, most people, when they hear that name, they think about him going on Johnny Carson, and we're talking about the Israeli mentalist. He's a little vague on what he calls himself, spoon bending, but entertainer. I would say most people would think of him in the same category of the amazing Kreskin, for example. And he was a person who basically was an entertainer in the 70s and 80s, very popular on all the big shows in the U.S. and in Britain and so forth. And that was the end of it. But it sounds like there was a whole different side to who Uri Geller is and was.
Absolutely. I mean, Uri Geller is a real puzzle. He's an enigma. You know, he's sort of a mystery wrapped in a mystery. I was able to interview him at his home in England, and also went to Israel to interview him there. He's 70 now. And he's still doing exactly what he did in the 70s, which is bend spoons, read people's minds. It was remarkable working with him multiple day after day after day, and watch him bend spoons in all kinds of circumstances. What I found most interesting about Geller to begin with was that from the declassified documents, I got about 1,000 pages of documents from the CIA through a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, on top of the fact that about 60,000 pages of these documents have been declassified and are at the National Archives. And in the new documentation, I saw a lot of interesting things. What I was after was the work that Uri Geller did with Ed Mitchell, the astronaut from Apollo 14, because I thought to be able to bring that element to the table was really surprising to me, and I felt it would inform readers in a way in which was really unique and original, because that information was not available previously. Was that essentially Ed Mitchell was a CIA front. After he came back from the moon, he quit NASA. He divorced his wife, and he began on this quest to understand ESP and psychokinesis. And he became very friendly with Uri Geller and was responsible for Geller coming to the United States to be studied by the CIA in this early program, which would later become known as remote viewing, at Stanford Research Institute. We're talking about 1972 here. And Mitchell was kind of the front for that. But learning that Geller was a CIA asset was remarkable. I also interviewed the doctor who was in charge of Geller's physiology, because biology plays a big part in this book. CIA doctors trying to figure out if this talent, if this sixth sense is biological in nature, if it's, where this function lives, essentially. And I also interviewed the handlers who worked the operations and the research experiments with Geller. And I report all of them in the book, and they're remarkable. And then, of course, the end of the CIA story with Geller in the 70s is that, guys in suits and dark sunglasses, I'm kind of adding a little theater there, but almost literally, show up, and the CIA realizes that they're from the Mossad. And the CIA has to make a decision because it wonders, rightly so, is Geller working for the Mossad? And so he had to be let go because of that unanswered question. And that mystery has remained across time. And when I went to interview Geller in Israel, in 2016, we talked about that. And there's a big reveal I don't want to give away at the end of the book, but I'll let readers decide, But when I found myself with Geller sitting in the living room of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and there were some really surprising, mysterious, puzzling elements of Geller's story that I think really makes readers kind of open up their mind and say, what really is going on here?
Now, before we leave the CIA years section, remote viewing is fascinating to me. We've spoken to Lynn Buchanan, who was involved with remote viewing. And again, get back to that funny men that stare at goats, and played for comedic effect, and, for example, that motion picture of several years ago. But again, pretty serious stuff when you're asking people to, kind of mentally view Soviet bases thousands of miles away.
Yes, and Lynn Buchanan was part of the Army's program, which was led by a physicist named Dale Graff, who I interview at length in the book. He's one of the main characters. He's kind of the progenitor of the program at the Defense Department. He learned from the CIA program and then brought the program over to Defense Department, first when he was at the Air Force and later when he was at DIA under Dr. Jack Verona. And here's where the real drama happens, because you have a bifurcation of ideas about how this program should be run between CIA and Defense Department, and it created enormous enmity, and it really created, sort of a battleground, because the CIA's position, after working with Geller and Ingo Swann and Pat Price and some of these other legendary remote viewers, if you will, drew the conclusion that individual people have a special talent, that this ability to know things unknowable is what Dr. Kit Green, the CIA's lead neurobiologist, says is individualistic. And so the way that they used the metaphor with me is they said, think about music, okay? So Annie can't sing in the shower, I promise you, or I do a very bad job. And think of Mozart, and think of the music that he wrote. And when you listen to that music and you listen to an average Joe sing, you realize there is such a different spectrum of talent there. And their idea was that the Uri Gellers, the Ingo Swanns, the Pat Prices were the Mozarts of intuition. And that is the research that they were pursuing. The research stopped for a number of reasons, and the Defense Department took over, and the Defense Department took a very different approach. The Defense Department's approach was remote viewing, extrasensory perception. This can be trained. It is a skill the same way shooting is a skill, or, doing jumping jacks is a skill. And practice will make perfect. And that was the fundamental difference that lay between the two organizations, and it created big problems because a number of the individuals that they pulled into the program, from my read of the research, were really poor performers. And the people who excelled in the Defense Department were people who were, as they would say, and who I interviewed, born psychic. But there was this catch-22 at the Defense Department. Because the Defense Department was insisted upon the fact that it was a skill that could be learned, the people who really were psychic, that's in quotes, couldn't say that they were born that way. They had to say they learned it. They had to say they did all this Army training, and that's why. And it created kind of an absurdity. It was what I call a catch-22, because you had a situation that was, false at its premise. And as I write in the book, it created an extraordinary amount of problems and ultimately led to the downfall of the program.
Our guest is Annie Jacobsen. We are talking about her recent book, Phenomena, and we'll be back right after this on the Paranormal Podcast. The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Gaia, the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. And keep listening, because once again, I'm going to tell you how you can get your first month for only 99 cents. Now, streaming is all the rage. Everybody is streaming series. You know, when I was a kid, you were stuck with, I think we had 5 channels. We were lucky here. Where I live, we had 3 networks and 2 independents, I think. And then maybe PBS too. So make that 6. Wow. And you watched what they wanted you to watch when you watched it. And really everything was very broad-based. There was nothing special or nothing targeted for special interests. And now, of course, that's changed with streaming. We can watch when we want, how much we want, and what we want. But there still wasn't a place for those of us who are interested in these kind of topics, the topics that we talk about on this show. However, that has all changed with Gaia. And with Gaia, you have a service dedicated to all of those topics we love. And the best thing is you can watch it so many different ways on all of your devices. You can watch Gaia on your Roku, on your Apple TV, your iPhone, your iPad, your Chromecast, Android device, Fire TV, your computer. Basically, if you're listening to this podcast, you can easily watch Gaia. Now, Gaia explores those topics that I was talking about, and it's always providing viewers with tremendous new content. And every week, I'm a member of Gaia, actually a paying member before we ever worked together, because I think it's such a cool service. And every week they send me updates on the newest shows. And I'm always amazed by the breadth and depth of them. And, of course, this week is no exception. For example, Buzzsaw, hosted by Sean Stone, is going to talk to Billy Carson about the Anunnaki, the alien beings that have influenced our species from the very depths of what it means to be human. And Billy says they have something that we will never have, and once we learn to reclaim our power, they will no longer control our future. Or you could watch Cosmic Disclosure with David Wilcock and Corey Good on wormholes and breakaway civilizations. Their guest is Mark McCandlish, and he reveals details of eyewitness sightings of UFOs as they make traversable wormholes within our atmosphere. And Corey Good fills in the details behind the theory and technology behind the use of such transportation practices. And there's George Norrie's Beyond Belief and Regina Meredith's Open Minds and Greg Braden's Missing Links and so much more on Gaia. There's just so much. I can't tell you all about it, but I can tell you where you can go and check it out. They've made up a special place for us to go look at it. Go to Gaia.com/Jim. That's GAIA.com/Jim. And they gave me permission. It was kind of like a kid in a candy store to handpick some shows for you that I thought that you would like. And I had them put them on that page for you, Gaia.com. Really, there's nothing like it. It's like a video buffet for the topics we love. So go to Gaia.com/Jim. And there is a red button where you can click and sign up, and that helps me because then they know where the listeners are coming from and the users are coming from. Sign up. Try your first month for only 99 cents. I mean, really, guys, 99 cents, you've got more of that in the cushions of your couch. Gaia is great. You're really going to want to check it out. Visit Gaia.com/Jim. That's GAIA.com/Jim to see what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. Thanks, Gaia. We're back on the Paranormal Podcast. Our guest is Annie Jacobsen, and we're talking about her recent book, Phenomena, all about the U.S. government's research into things like remote viewing and psychokinesis, fascinating stuff. Now, when we move on to the section of the Defense Department years, you talk about psychic soldiers. My goodness, what are psychic soldiers?
Well, that's a little bit of what we were talking about before break, which is that, look, the Defense Department loves manuals. I mean, counterinsurgency, there's a manual. How to build bombs, there's a manual. Survival, there's a manual. So remote viewing, well, there needed to be a manual. And interestingly, that manual was written by the CIA's lead psychic, Ingo Swann, who was absolutely of the mindset that, he was born psychic. But yet, for reasons that remain debatable, he agreed that people, or he moved toward this idea that people could be trained to be psychic. my read on the situation was that the individuals who were trained failed, where those who believed that they were born psychic excelled. And again, this is, across many years, and there was many failures and many successes by all of the people, but on balance, one of the great conundrums of the Defense Department program, and again, this is from the scientists that I interviewed who were running the program, was that they were stuck in this catch-22 because there was a psychic named Angela Della Fiora, for example, and I tell her story in Phenomena, really brought, for the first time, in depth about who she was and how she came to be part of the program and some of the successes that she had. And it became clear to many of the analysts who were running her, that she was the one that was able to deliver them the information which would then become actionable, that they could actually lead to results, whether it was, there are these remarkable stories looking for Gaddafi's chemical weapons, for example, and Angela Della Fiora was able to give them the name of the boat which these chemical weapons were being hidden, and then it proved there was a result, this is where they were. So you would have this kind of win, an operational win, and Della Fiora would then be given more responsibility, more tasking, more operations, leaving the ones that were being trained to be psychic behind. And, it just created enormous problems, and I write about them in the book because, they would say, look, we're not getting access to operations the way she is, and that's because it's favoritism, and behind the scenes, the scientists would be saying among themselves in memos, she's delivering results.
Now, that's a question, because I think when you talk about psychic phenomena, not people necessarily follow this sort of thing or believers, but people generally say, well, if they're really psychic, why don't they just go pick the lottery numbers and that kind of thing. But my point is that there's a difference between kind of almost like something you would see on Bewitched or something like that, which is, I think, what many people's goalposts are, that you would have to be perfect. I think here you would just be looking for statistical significance. Do you think there's proof for not that kind of bewitched power where you can just wiggle your nose and have something happen, but statistical significance in terms of being able to know things that we would not know by normal means?
Well, you're absolutely right, and this becomes one of the ways in which scientific skeptics, who play an important role in all of this, including in my book Phenomena, the scientific skeptics use that bewitched goalpost to exactly make their point, and it's a good point, which is that ever since the scientific revolution, science, to be called science, must meet 5 sort of thresholds and go through 5 steps: observation, hypothesis, prediction, experimentation. Then you can draw a conclusion. And these 5 steps must be repeatable. So your goalpost analogy is terrific, meaning you have to be able to pass it through the goalpost every time. And if not, it's not science, it's hypothesis. And the argument on the other side, for those who are in the work, say, well, it's fickle by nature, and that's kind of the heart and soul of the debate. And when you look at all the documents, across the board, and you're studying them seriously, you realize both sides have a point, because, and certainly the scientific skeptic point about it doesn't pass the scientific method is entirely accurate, and that is just a given truth. That's the ground truth. But when you look at some of the remarkable fickle results, occasional, that's where, to the objective eye, to the person who doesn't have a horse in the race, who can be neutral about all this, doesn't need to believe and doesn't need to not believe, that's where I think you have some of those aha moments. And of course I write them out in the book, whether it's finding the downed aircraft, locating the weapons depot, being able to pull names and code words off of files from a place where you physically are not. That kind of resulting information is hard to argue with, that there's something inexplicable going on.
Now, consciousness. Were there studies on the nature of consciousness?
I think consciousness, this idea of what makes us human and what is it, what is the broader idea to which we are attached, right? In a sort of very philosophical, theoretical idea. They often call it the hard problem of consciousness. I mean, no scientist wants to go near that subject because it just is a rabbit hole. And so, you have a character like Ed Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, who dedicated his life after he came back from the moon to the study of consciousness, to this idea of what is the reality that undergirds all of this. And I think if it's looked at poetically, there's a lot of really interesting ideas to contemplate. Where you get into trouble is the scientific discussions about what consciousness is, because it's undefinable and unknowable.
And it's very interesting you bring this out, because I feel this way as well, is that I'm a big believer in science. I think science is great. We couldn't do what we're doing now without science. Thank goodness for science. On the other hand, maybe one doesn't, you said unknowable. Maybe to some extent some of this stuff is unknowable in that it can't fit the scientific paradigm. It doesn't mean the scientific paradigm is bad, but it's just something that is, you can't measure in a test tube or on a scale. It's just something else. I mean, that's the challenge.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head here. And let me give you a practical example for listeners that might kind of sum up what you're talking about and what I'm also talking about. So, and this is in terms of a national security rubric. So, one of the remote viewers who worked at CIA and also at the Defense Department, who's probably among the legends of this, his name is Joe McMoneagle, and he was actually remote viewer 001. He was the first Defense Department official remote viewer. And he is in that category, many say, as sort of one of the giants of all of this. So the way in which he caught the Pentagon's attention was because of his work in Vietnam. And when I say his work, he had a regular job, he was infantry. And yet the stories about him were that he had a sixth sense. So he's out in the jungle with his guys. And McMoneagle says, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, we're not going down there. There's an ambush. And would hold back, and those who stayed back with him would stay alive, and those who would continue on would be killed. And in the war theater, ground truth, what does that really mean? Okay, staying alive is your job. So McMoneagle described that as a sixth sense, and he became part of the remote viewing program because of that. Now flash forward to 2009, and you're in Mosul, Iraq, and you have a Marine with a group of soldiers who says to his team, don't go down that road. There's an IED buried there. Mm-hmm. They send a robot down, and the IED goes off. That soldier is now interesting to the Office of Naval Research, and he's brought back from the war theater, and he's looked at inside of a laboratory run by the Office of Naval Research as part of its new program into ESP, into precognition. I told you in the beginning of the show that the Office of Naval Research calls it the Spidey sense. Mm-hmm. But the only difference between McMoneagle and that Marine is that 50 years have passed in between them. And whereas McMoneagle was then studied by parapsychologists and, with very limited access to understanding his physiology, boy, the world has changed in the 50 years. And that Marine at the Office of Naval Research is now looked at by computers. His brain is looked at in fMRI scans. The most advanced military technology in the world is used to try and understand what gave that soldier the power to think ahead. The Defense Department also calls it sense-making. Because the way the Defense Department looks at it today is, if that is possible, we want to study it, and we want to understand it, and then we want to be able to accelerate it. And that is where it becomes incredibly interesting to a national security reporter like myself, because you're merging science and technology with an age-old mystery of essentially divination, knowing the future, knowing the unknowable. How did that Marine know that IED was buried there?
And it's interesting to me because I think the vast majority of people would say, oh, yeah, sure, they did this superstitious research back in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, but we're so much smarter now. They don't look into this sort of thing seriously anymore. I think that's probably the prevailing view out there.
I think it is, but if you can remove that stigma and you can ask yourself, what if advanced technology, and I'm talking neuro, bio, nanotechnology. I mean, think about that. Neuro meaning brain, bio meaning physiology, nano meaning tiny meaning computers, okay? So Defense Department technology, and we know this from all the reporting I did in the last book and elsewhere, the Defense Department can put small, tiny computers, i.e. brain chips, into soldiers' brains, and they do. Okay, so you're using nanobiotechnology, neuro-nanobiotechnology, to understand what goes on in the brains of soldiers. And what if we are able to uncover the mystery, this age-old mystery, and that it's not superstition after all, it's not magic, it is some physiology inside the human, it is the Mozart gene, if you will. That's what the Defense Department is after.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. If you're interested in this, you just need to get this book. It's pretty simple. And Annie, I'm sure people can get the book anywhere fine books are sold, correct?
Yes, Phenomena by Annie Jacobsen.
It is Phenomena, the secret history of the U.S. government's investigations into extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. Any last thoughts for our audience, Annie, before we wrap up today?
I just am so delighted to be on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you, and really, really interesting stuff. I love serious discussion about these things. That's the idea behind the program, and we certainly have that today. Again, Phenomena, the secret history of the U.S. government's investigations into extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks again.
Yet another fascinating discussion with Annie Jacobsen. We certainly enjoyed it, and we hope that you did as well. And next, after this, we're going to talk with Preston Dennett about inside UFOs. Stay tuned. When we look for sponsors and people we're going to work with on these shows, I look for things that I would actually use or do actually use, and I think they can bring some value to the audience. So our next sponsor is My Patriot Supply, and I sought them out because over the years I've become increasingly convinced that it's important to be prepared, not paranoid, but be prepared. Sensible preparation just makes sense. I'll give you an example. In 2003, where I live in the state of Ohio, there was a big blackout. In fact, there was a big blackout in a big chunk of the United States, the Northeast blackout of 2003. And many Americans did not have power for some time, for some hours. In my case, it was about 18 hours. I think in all, about 55 million Americans were impacted. Look it up if you don't remember or don't believe me. And that convinced me, wow, what if this happened for a prolonged period of time? What if we didn't have electricity? What would happen? Because it was really eerie. I'll never forget it. Walking out on my front porch, I live in a pretty heavily populated suburban area, and there was nothing but stars. It was totally black. No street lights, no house lights. The only lights you might see are some passing cars, and that was it. And that was a very bizarre thing. Also bizarre was the fact that when you turned on your tap water, there was no water. And that was downright scary. Now, luckily, that was only for 18 hours. That was kind of a minor inconvenience. But what if it happened for a longer time? And these days, I got to tell you, I'm very concerned about North Korea and their possibility of using something like an EMP that would knock out the power grid for weeks, months, maybe years. And if you don't believe me, look it up. It was just featured in one of the big mainstream American papers. Look up North Korean EMPs. I'm not making this up. This is a real thing. So when a listener asked me this last week, they said, Jim, aren't you, it's a little over the top. Should you really be fear-mongering? That's the word they use. I said, well, let me tell you why it's not fear-mongering. And I went on to explain what I just told you. I worry. Things can happen, scary things that can happen. Those rogue nations like North Korea, cyber terrorists shutting down the banking system, or natural disasters or the spread of a deadly disease like Ebola. And when the unpredictable happens, I think it just makes sense to have a plan in place to survive. You need to ensure you can feed yourself and your family, and that's why I really believe emergency preparedness is so important. And that's where my Patriot Supply delivers. I trust and use them for my family, and you can too. Take advantage of my podcast survival special today. Get their 4-week survival food supply for only $99. That's a fair price for emergency food that, get this, lasts up to 25 years. It's ready for survival when you need it. So call 888-440-7839 or go online to preparewithjim.com. Prepare for the unexpected and make the call while things are still calm. And let's hope they stay that way. But again, be prepared. If nothing else, it's great peace of mind. Because $99 does ensure that peace of mind with a month of survival food. Act now, 888-440-7839 or preparewithjim.com, 888-440-7839 or go to preparewithjim.com. Thanks, My Patriot Supply. And I think you'll be very interested in this show today because when we talk about UFOs, not only what we see in the skies is very interesting to us, but the idea of what are inside of these UFOs and maybe who are inside of those UFOs. And we have a great book to discuss and a great guest on that topic. The book is Inside UFOs, True Accounts of Contact with Extraterrestrials, and our guest is Preston Dennett, and we had him on the show a few years ago, and so glad to have him back. And Preston has been a long-time investigator in all of this. It goes back to 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Now, since then, he's interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He's a field investigator for MUFON, ghost hunter, paranormal researcher, and the author of 16 books and more than 100 articles on the UFOs and paranormal. His writing has been translated into many different languages. He's been on many radio and TV programs, and he has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States. And he currently resides in Southern California. That means it's really early for Preston. It's 9 a.m. Eastern as we talk today. Preston, welcome to the program, and thanks for getting up so early.
Hey, no problem. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
I always feel guilty when we have an early morning interview and I see that somebody's on the West Coast and it's it's like 5 o'clock in the morning. It's like, oh no. But so glad you spent time with us. Now, this idea of contactees, abductees, all of these things has always been very interesting to me. When you look at the body of sightings, what are we talking about in the percentages? Do you know what the rough percentages of experiences that have this kind of contactee, abductee component to them?
Well, I think it's a lot more common than people realize. I know there's quite a bit of sightings. Sightings are occurring on a daily basis. But if you think about it, only one person in 100 really reports their sighting. And that's just a sighting when it comes to actual contact. I think the percentages of reporting are much less. This is when I got involved in UFO research. I heard a quote from J. Allen Hynek, the pioneer of UFO research. And he said 1 in 40 people have had an onboard UFO experience.
So 1 in 40 of all of us, not even people who report, is that what he's saying?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought, that's way too much. I thought, no way. That's just impossible.
Well,
I know.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I figured I knew 40 people, and so that's how I kind of started. I started asking people earnestly, and I didn't have to ask 40 people, and I found about 5 people within my own circle of family and friends and coworkers who had an onboard experience or face-to-face encounter. So yeah, it's pretty common, I think.
Well, it's one of those things that, to me, it's one of the most terrifying things because you think this is typically something that is against your will. Now, is that the case? Do people, when they have these reports, do they feel compelled, intimidated that they have to do what these ETs say? Do they go willingly? Is it a mix? Because everybody thinks of the nightmare scenario of probes and kind of the Betty Barney Hill case. Is that the norm, or people, do they, once they meet these ETs, they want to go along, or does it feel like they're being forced?
Well, you get both. I think that when people think of abductions, yeah, we think of, these gray type ETs coming to our bedroom or pulling us from a car along a lonely highway. And that does happen, but certainly not the only type of encounter people have. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who had very friendly encounters, were essentially invited aboard and maybe not given like free roaming of the ship. But yeah, are treated very well, not undressed and examined and forced to do unpleasant biological experiments. But yeah, you get the whole range. Some people do have very scary encounters. Others are very friendly. So yeah, it's kind of the ET behavior falls under the same umbrella, really, as normal human behavior. There are friendly ones, and there are ones that are not so friendly.
That's an excellent point, I would think. Now, to that line, I think people think that if ET exists, that there's one species of ET, and I think most of the people, and you mentioned it earlier, think of that kind of alien gray with the big eyes and so forth. Is that what you found, or in your research and all of your interviews, are there many different species potentially?
Yeah, and that's what's actually kind of frustrating, to be honest. I sort of expected there to be one type of ET and that it would have tentacles and scales and not look at all like us. And that's just not what the evidence is showing. We're showing many different types of ETs, but generally humanoid. I'm going to say about half the cases I get are some form of the grays, but you get a whole variation there. And beyond the grays, there's praying mantis, there's Nordic, I guess you'll call it, human-looking, and also just sort of this weird catch-all category of humanoids. Like there's one case in the book involving an 8-foot-tall or a 9-foot-tall humanoid with looks human but had a really broad face, large forehead, and orange kind of straw-like hair. So wow. Yeah, very strange. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's, what's really strange is I never get the same exact description of an ET.
Now let me ask you this. I've done shows with people like Mike Cleland who have talked about screen memories and owls. Do you believe that the fact that these are so different, is it in reality, do you believe that there are different species, or do you think that maybe in some ways these particular ETs are projecting themselves in different ways? Because if they've traveled here, they're obviously much more advanced than we are and may be able to project things onto our minds. Do you think that some of this may be some trickery involved, kind of projecting themselves, either physically shape-shifting or just kind of saying, I look like, I think one of the ones you mentioned in the book is a praying mantis-like alien. I look like a praying mantis, and this time I look like a gray. What do you think about that?
No, I think what we're seeing is probably what they look like for the most part. Yes, they do have screen memories, and that usually occurs to people who are having early experiences or just beginning to become aware of it, or it's very common in childhood. People have these figures come into their bedroom, and they'll see them as, one lady saw them as 3-foot-tall teddy bears. Owls.
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah, owls are very common. Superheroes, I've heard. Deer, all kinds of animals. So yeah, they definitely can do that. But I think when someone sees a gray or a praying mantis or a reptilian or what have you, for the most part, what they're seeing is what the ET actually does look like.
Now, in terms of their intentions, now you mentioned some are nice, some are not nice. Do you think alien contact is something that we need to be afraid of, or is it something we should welcome, or is it kind of a case-by-case basis?
Well, I flip-flop a little bit. In the beginning, I thought, oh my God, this is horrific. All these abductions against our will. I had a pretty dim view of it. But, 30 years later, I've kind of shifted to the other side. Because I don't think they're hostile. I don't think this is a dangerous experience for the most part. I just don't see that the ET intention is to hurt people or to scare them. I've got no cases where they're what I would call sadistic or, doing Nazi-like torture for the fun of it or purposely trying to scare people. No, I don't get that at all. So I think for the most part, their agenda is basically benign. I mean, they've got multiple agendas, no doubt. They're trying to hybridize with us. I think that's pretty clear. I got a lot of cases like that. But above and beyond that, when someone's taken inside a UFO, they're usually given messages that fall into 3 different categories.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be like alternative energy. People are often shown the engine room and told how these objects fly around. Or they're given messages or warnings about environmental disaster of some kind. Often it's warnings of nuclear proliferation or warnings about pollution or warlike ways, this type of thing. That's very common. I'm going to say that's probably the most common thing people are told. And after that, it would be messages about alternative healing or psychic development or things like that, spiritual messages. So to me, that sort of shows their agenda is very interested. They're very interested in us, all things human, and seem to want to help us with our planet in terms of the problems we're having and raising our own awareness and our sort of, I think they're trying to wake us up in a lot of different ways.
Where do you think they come from?
Gosh, I wish I knew. This is sort of the $1,000,000 question because people have asked. I've got one lady, she asked, where do you guys come from? And they said, oh, we're from a place you don't know about yet. And that they give that kind of answer a lot. Another person asked and they said, oh, it's not important. So, no, we don't know. I mean, Zeta Reticula has been thrown around with the Greys. And I've heard that a couple of times from other independent sources. I don't know. I think I'm a believer that they are biological beings from other planets like us. So I'm thinking that's probably where they come from, other star systems. There's some evidence that they come from the future, which I know how that sounds, but boy, there's some weird time travel aspects to a lot of these cases. So that's possibly a factor as well. And finally, I mean, there's evidence they've been here for a very long time and have bases. So, that's a really tough question, and I think they've kind of avoided telling us exactly where they come from for a number of reasons. Probably mostly because of our warlike ways, and we are getting a hold of their technology. I think we're flying these things around to a limited extent, and they have to take steps to protect themselves. So, I don't know.
Now, I want to follow up on that question. You said that you think that we're kind of flying around similar craft. How did we get that? How did we, was there a crash that many people point to Roswell. Was there a crash? We reversed engineered? Has there been some kind of technology exchange? If in fact the powers that be, because I was going to ask if you thought the powers that be know what's going on. They have to know something's going on if we're flying around flying saucers. So how did that come about, in your opinion?
I think it started with UFO crashes, and no, it's not just Roswell. There's Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. There's Aztec. There's Paradise Valley. And, I wrote a series of books of UFOs over various states, like UFOs over California, New York, New Mexico, Arizona. Colorado's coming out later. And I have to tell you, every single one of these states has multiple UFO crash reports.
Wow.
So, yeah, I'm like, what the? I mean, I could not believe it. There's a lot more UFO crashes than people realize. So I think we've had this technology for quite some time. And beyond that, there are a number of cases. Well, there's one case in the book. The guy was taken on board and he's talking to these praying mantis type ETs. And they told him flat out, oh, yeah, we're trading technology with all the major governments. And so are several other ET species.
Now, that's kind of interesting, though. Why would they trade? Okay, and it's probably impossible to get to their motives. But if you think about it, if they're aware of our warlike ways, and we're recording this on May 23rd, and just last night there was this horrible tragedy in Manchester, in the UK, where at this count, and it may change by the time you hear this, 22 people were killed by these savages, or savage in this case. But I guess my point is that if ET were aware of our warlike ways, why would they give us technology so we could just perpetuate that?
Yeah, I wondered that myself. They could stop the cover-up overnight. They could fix a lot of problems that we're having, like Fukushima. I think they're wiser than that. I don't think that necessarily they all want us to have their technology. It's a very difficult situation to make sense of. I do know that we have the technology. I think at this point there's just way too many reports from government insiders and whistleblowers to say that we don't. I think it's pretty clear that we have our hands on at least some of it. I'm not sure why they would hand this over to us or why they would even allow us to keep it. But yeah, I think we do have it, and it's created a very sticky situation.
Yeah, that is. Now, in terms of stories, because we love stories on this show, we have a show called Campfire where people call in with their various paranormal stories, and not as much as I'd like, but we do occasionally get the UFO story here and there. What is one or two of your favorite stories you have in this book? Because I know you have quite a few.
Oh, yeah. I'd say my favorite one is the first chapter. It involves a gentleman by the name of Kevin Kamen. He's a Navy medic, a corpsman. And it turned out his best friend, the guy he bunks with on this ship, was a contactee, and told him one day, oh, yeah, I've been in contact with aliens since I was a little boy. They take me on their ship. They've taken me to their planet and other planets. Kevin didn't believe his friend for a second, but became intrigued by what he was saying. He said, oh, yeah, well, if that's true, I'd love to meet your little green men, your little green friends, is what he said. And Larry said, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. Comes back and says, okay, yeah, they said yes, they'll meet with you. A couple of days go by and comes back to the bunk room and says, okay, they're up on deck, go up on deck and you'll see them. Kevin, still disbelieving, goes up on deck, and lo and behold, there's this giant, he says it was kind of diamond-shaped or star-shaped, this object. It was huge. It was much bigger than the ship itself. His ship was about 600 feet long. And this thing extended past it on both sides. And he's completely freaking out. He says it's absolutely beautiful. Runs to get another witness. I mean, there's lots of people on the deck of the ship. And no sooner is he runs to the mess cook there, shaking his shoulders. He's no longer on the Navy ship. He finds himself on board the UFO looking down at the Navy ship from above. And begins this actually pretty long, involved encounter. I'll shorten it a little bit, but he remembers flying over to his hometown.
Wow.
It was daylight when he started, right? He's in his hometown in Kankakee, Illinois, inside this UFO, and it's daylight there. So that can't be. There's got to be some weird time travel aspect. And he's looking down at his mom, who's teaching in a church. He can see through the walls of the UFO, through the walls of the church, to where his mom is teaching. He's like, okay, what's going on? Suddenly there's a shift. This UFO moves a couple of blocks, over the town to where his dad works at a bank building. Same thing. You can see through the walls of the UFO into the bank building where his dad is having a meeting with executives.
Huh.
And this is when the ETs start talking to him, and they say, your parents did a really good job. They're very honorable people and did a good job. Kevin's like, okay, what does this mean? He doesn't know. Next thing he knows, well, a lot happened. He says he might have forgotten some of this. But the next thing he knows, he's looking down through the bottom of the ship, and he sees what looks like a desert area. Then he sees craters, and he's thinking, okay, craters, is this a bombing range? What's going on? But it's gray. And he says, gosh, it's looked almost like the moon to me. And suddenly the ship comes up over the horizon line, and there off in the distance, the size of a softball, is the planet Earth. And he knew at this point, okay, this is the moon. And he says he nearly messed his pants, pinched himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. At the point he actually bled. But yeah, he was really scared. But at this point, the ET started talking to him. They have a long conversation with him, explained to him that they are in contact with all the governments on Earth. They're trading technology. They can speak all our languages. They've been watching us for a very long time. But when we started exploding nuclear bombs, this caused them to pay much closer attention. This brought a lot of the ETs to our planet, they said, and also started what they called a countdown clock. And they actually took him to this area and showed him these disasters that would take place. And that included hurricanes and earthquakes, mudslides, tornadoes, more hurricanes. He says there was a lot of hurricanes coming up. And they told him, this is your destiny, and your destiny will be fulfilled. They had a very long conversation. He asked him a lot of things. He asked him about Roswell. They said, yes, that did occur. He asked him about God, and they said they wouldn't discuss it. They're not going to discuss race, religion, or politics.
Hey, they seem smarter than most people these days.
Right? Well, I found that interesting because race, religion, and politics, we're struggling a little bit with that right now.
Right.
So maybe they were kind of hands off on that. I don't know. But that's what they said. And he says he was up there for, at least probably 20 minutes to over an hour, maybe two. A lot of it he doesn't remember, but he finally got the courage to ask, or he asked, where are you from? And this is really interesting. He says suddenly the room itself expanded in size, and it turned into a star chart, a three-dimensional star chart. You could see our solar system, all these stars around, way off in the distance. There was a little red light blinking, and they said, that's where we come from. And they actually told him the name of the place, and he says he couldn't pronounce it, couldn't remember it. It was just this big, long, nonsense word as far as he was concerned. And, finally he says, well, what do you look like? And they said, well, we're not little and we're not green. And mind you, this is all telepathic in his head, male voices. There was 3 male voices he heard speaking perfect English. And finally he just turns around and sees them and gets an incredible shock. They're praying mantis-type ETs. He said they looked almost exactly like praying mantis, except they were 15 feet tall. I'm like, oh, Kevin, probably I'm thinking you mean maybe 10 feet, because this is what I usually hear. He says, no, they were right next to me. They were more than twice my height. He's almost 6 feet, and he says it was like standing next to a basketball board. They were very tall. One actually walked across the room, stood right next to him, and started fussing with the console there. He described this console as looking very plain, having a few colored lights, maybe some what looked like oven dials, and it was fussing around with it, and turns to him and said, so, would you like to go to our planet? And he said, no, don't want to go to our planet, your planet. At this point, he was just too scared. He felt like he had a possibility of becoming a specimen and just wanted it to end.
Yeah.
And And that's what happened. They reached out, they touched his shoulder, and he started screaming in a panic and woke up back in his bed on the ship. He's screaming, he's sweating, he's hyperventilating. He realizes, okay, he's back, calms down for a second, when suddenly the curtain swings open, the curtain around his bed, and there's his friend. He's grinning from ear to ear and says, "So, how did you like your ride?" He didn't like it. He lost that friend, actually. He was really upset about the whole experience for a very long time. And actually forgot quite a bit about it. Sort of this shroud of amnesia came over him.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he remembered being taken on board. He remembered some images. He didn't remember what they looked like or what they told him. And didn't remember actually for a couple of years until he was watching a nature show. And lo and behold, they did a close-up of a praying mantis. And this is what I call a cue. I've heard this from a number of other cases. This cue sort of broke down the walls of amnesia that was surrounding this experience, and he remembered it all. But yeah, he was never abducted. He was never, physically examined or undressed or anything like that. He just had this conversation with these guys. So it's not your typical encounter, but one I've heard before.
Now, here's a question that I have, and I face this with my campfire show sometimes as well, although I feel the vast majority of people I talk to are very sincere and something did happen to them. How, having interviewed hundreds of people about their various experiences, whether it's UFOs or anything else, but specifically with this, have you developed kind of a spidey sense in terms of, for lack of a better phrase, to try to ferret out when, somebody's telling you a tall tale, and as opposed to when somebody is giving you the real deal and something dramatic happened to them? Right.
Absolutely. I mean, there are certain, what would you call them? Red flags, I guess, that I look for. Initially, what I'll do is a preliminary interview. Then I'll do a follow-up interview to see if their story changes. And if I feel like they're telling the truth, that's when I do a full-on interview. And you can tell pretty soon whether a person's telling the truth or not because of their emotions. Their emotional reactions to this can be very intense. And it's not at all unusual for people to start crying or have chills or refuse to discuss certain aspects. But for me, the clincher is when they start to report details that you rarely hear or are not very well known, even within the UFO community. Like I mentioned with the room changing size. This is something I hear, not a whole lot, but, pretty regularly. And not a lot of people know about that. And so when he told me that, Kevin Cannon, I just like, here we go again. I can sort of predict. I mean, I've heard this so many times. A lot of what people tell me does not surprise me. I've heard it a million times. So there's all these little sort of details that I look for, which help verify. And after that, I'll ask for character witnesses, talk to Kevin Cannon's wife. And she says, oh, yeah, he's been talking about this for years. He'll tell anyone who will listen to him. So there are various ways. I don't think I really get a lot of hoaxers. It does happen where I feel like, this person, I just don't believe them.
Right.
But for the most part, people they're really reluctant to tell their stories. I always get some caveat before they start. They're like, I'm not on drugs. I've got a great education. I'm not a liar.
And I think that's really interesting because, you get, and I'm not saying this is impossible, but sometimes, you'll talk to people that say, I communicate with the aliens every week at 10 a.m. And that's a little more difficult to believe, harder to believe. Not saying it's impossible, but it's harder to believe than someone that says, look, I've never had anything like this happen to me before or since, but this happened to me and it really did happen to me. When somebody says that kind of raises my antennae.
Right. And some people, they have evidence. There's a couple of cases, people send me x-rays of implants, which are very impressive, along with doctor statements saying that they don't know what this is. People have scars on their body. I've seen those. I've seen landing traces. So there's all kinds of sort of circumstantial evidence surrounding these experiences. In fact, most people who have a very intense experience have some form of that. So yeah, there's evidence to support this above and beyond their testimony.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting stuff. One thing I want to ask you about, because we've had reports of this on the Campfire Show, and it's always fascinated me, the idea of missing time. What have you learned over the years about this idea of missing time?
Well, there's no doubt it does take place. When someone has a close-up sighting, your chances of missing time are greatly increased. By that I mean, if a UFO comes within a couple of 100 feet, I'm like, probably more than a sighting here. Because missing time can happen without people realizing it. We're not always paying super close attention to the clock. And I've found this out. I'll interview someone and thinking it's just a sighting and find out later, no. They start having dreams and other details that make me realize, oh gosh, they've had missing time. Often, if they have a severe emotional reaction, if they become extremely frightened by a sighting or super duper excited, that's an indicator. I think missing time is imposed upon the witnesses by the ETs. I don't think it's a psychological defense mechanism, such as we see with war victims sometimes. They have their trauma surrounded in amnesia. Don't think that's what's taking place here. I think it's imposed by the ETs, basically say as much to the witnesses. You won't remember this. It's very common, or you will remember this when it's time. So, yeah, missing time, I think, occurs a lot more than people realize, and generally extends from about 15 minutes to 1 hour, 2 hours, and in a few outlying cases, a couple of days, the Travis Walton case was 5 days. I heard one case of 2 weeks. I think that's the longest I've ever heard.
What do you think happens during this missing time? Any theories?
Yeah, I think we know pretty much what's going on. I think we've got a pretty good handle. There's a physical examination. These messages are given. They're taken to see the engine room. They may have various procedures performed upon them. There's all kinds of bizarre things that happen aboard UFOs. People may be taken to what's called the breathing pool, where they're submerged in liquid and told to breathe it, or given all kinds of information. They're put in what looks like a dentist chair and have a helmet put over their head, and all this information comes into them. For the most part, yeah, it's messages or in examinations. That's probably, I think, most of what's going on. I don't think that they're, again, using us for, slaves or eating us for food or anything like that. I think that they're mostly interested in helping us.
So you think that these examinations are just like scientists checking us out and checking out our biology, understanding how we work, those kind of things, no more, no less?
Well, there is sort of a case-by-case aspect to this where you have to realize some people do have, unpleasant encounters, and some have, people have been healed. That was actually what the subject of one of my books, UFO Healings. So it can be very benevolent. I think they know more about the human body than we do. They're very interested in it. There's no doubt in my mind that they are taking genetic material from us. I keep running across that. People are being shown babies that look half gray, half human, and are being told, oh yeah, these babies are yours. So that is a very strong theme that goes on with these encounters, for sure, particularly when it comes to the grays. But yeah, they definitely know a lot about our bodies. They're very, very interested in all things human. I'm not exactly sure why. What's so special about us? But they seem to be obsessed with us.
Well, it certainly is an interesting topic, and this is an interesting treatment of it. The book is Inside UFOs, True Accounts of Contact with Extraterrestrials. Our guest has been Preston Dennett. Preston, where can people find the book and connect with all of your work?
Actually, I have a website, which is, if you Google my name, it'll take you right there. The actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. And I have all my books up there, excerpts. You can contact me as well through my website. And my books are, of course, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other online retailers. And I always enjoy hearing from people if they've had an experience or just have a question.
Well, Preston, it has been a great discussion and continued success with all of your books, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks, Jim.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that show as much as I did. Fascinating stuff from Annie and Preston, and our plan is just to keep it coming just like that, the good stuff, the good interviews, the good shows, and we hope that you continue to enjoy the Paranormal Podcast. And hey, while you're at it, tell a friend. This week, tell one friend you think would be interested in the free shows and show them the way. Maybe take their phone and actually subscribe for them with their permission, of course, and we'd certainly appreciate it. We'll talk to you next time on the Paranormal Podcast, and have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye. Now for the legal disclaimer. We do not accept money from publishers or content producers in exchange for interviews. However, as with most media outlets, in the majority of cases, we do receive complimentary copies of books and DVDs that we feature on our podcasts. Your purchases of books, DVDs, and other items via our Amazon.com links benefit Jim Harold and JimHarold.com and help us continue our programming. The sponsor messages you hear on the programs are paid endorsements, although we really do like them. For the full disclaimer, go to JimHarold.com, and thanks for listening.